Thanks so much for stopping by and watching Anna's Aqua Home. I'm Anna and I am in my Aqua Home. Today's video, I have a video showing you how to make this cute little mini quilt. It's either a mini quilt or a mug rug. You can even put some thicker stabilizer and make it a trivet or a hot mat. But these steps, it's pretty much, I like to call it a mini quilt because you would follow these exact steps when making a larger quilt. So it's one of my longer videos, probably the longest video I'll have for a while, but I really enjoyed making this and I hope you enjoy watching it. Thanks so much for staying around. To start, we are going to get 9 squares. My squares are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and we're going to need 9 of those. I have a bunch of different aqua fabrics left over from a quilt, but you can use a bunch of different little scraps. You can use whatever colors you want, and you just want to lay them out so that you think they're balanced and ready to go. Once you like the look of them, you can go ahead and start picking which ones you're going to sew together. You're going to sew 3 if you want to split it up into different lines. So 3 lines. So let's go ahead and start by sewing 2 on each of those lines. Alright, so here's my sewing machine. I just have a regular 1/4 of an inch seam. Always back stitch at the beginning and the end. We want this little mug rug to last for a while. And I'm going to be chain piecing them. That basically means that as soon as one is done, the next one just goes right in, and you don't have to stop and cut the threads between each set that you're sewing. This just helps it goes a lot faster. And then you'll see at the end, you just kind of clip them all apart. You want to make sure they don't overlap as you're sewing. And then once you've done all the sewing that you need, then you can go ahead and start cutting those threads. Now that we have that trimmed off, we're going to go ahead and add that final piece. So again, we've got our 3 rows. This is the easiest way to put this together. And then you're going to sew your 3rd piece onto each row. I didn't trim a lot out of this video, so that you want to get some fabric and start sewing along with me. We can do this together. So with that same 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you can go ahead and sew the 3rd block onto your row. Now, consistency is most important with seam allowance, especially when you're doing triangles and squares that are going to have points that come together. You can have a slightly larger 1/4 of an inch or a slightly smaller 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but as long as you stay consistent and it's all the same size, then your sewing will turn out just fine. I'm going to clip all these apart and we're going to lay them down. I like to clip all the threads as I go. That way I don't have extra threads hanging off my project. Alright, you saw me just finger press right there. You can iron in between each of these steps, but I'm just going to go ahead and finger press it. And whichever way you want that seam allowance to go, you want the opposite seam allowance to go. So here I've got the 1 row folded in, and the other row, their seam allowance is folded the opposite direction. That way it sits really nice and flat once you sew it together. You just need to keep track of which seam allowance is going which direction, so that way as you put more and more rows together, each row is not switching in between blocks. I'm going to have to put the needle down and lift the foot there just to get that one seam allowance to lay flat since it was facing the other direction. All right, trim off the threads again, and we are going to add our third and final row and make this 9-patch square. The 9-patch is probably one of the easiest sewing blocks to start with. Again, it's just squares. You can do this with any size squares, honestly. I would love to make a big quilt with just 9 squares. So each square would need to be quite big, but I haven't done that yet, maybe in the future. Here we go, lining up those seam allowances. If you want to have a particular pattern, you can always lay it down in between each of these. That way it really helps, because as you're sewing, the pattern can get a little bit messed up if you sew the wrong way. There we go. I'm just showing you that the bottom one is facing up, so this top one needs to face down. Get those fabric pieces lined up, back stitch to end, and our mini quilt top is done. Here it is laid out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and finger press it. Again, you can iron it at this time. I'm just going to use my finger and my nail and just flatten it out a little bit, and this will, for me, it will be perfectly flat, and I'll be able to finish quilting it and sewing it without ironing it. Here we go. Look at those corners. Consistency in that seam allowance allows all 4 of those corners to meet exactly square, exactly together. So now it's time for the binding and the back, or the back and the batting. Excuse me there, too many things that start with a B. So I'm using cotton low loft batting, and you can use multiple different kinds. This is what I had a scrap of. So I'm going to go ahead and lay this on there. Cut this out. You'll see I'll use a little bit of extra around the edges, and that's just so if it shifts a little bit while I'm quilting it, I'll still have some room for error. But after I quilt it, you'll see, and we're going to actually go ahead and trim that batting completely down to the quilt top size. It was a little not square, so I'm going to go ahead and just trim extra, still leaving a little bit. Now with this size quilt, you could certainly use just a small scrap of backing material, but I do have this pretty backing material. I've got quite a bit of it, so I'm going to go ahead and just cut a small piece off of this. And I want a little bit more extra than I did of the batting, because I'm actually going to use this backing. I'm going to do a turnover binding. So the same material that I'm going to back it with is what I'm going to bind it with. So I'll show you that a little bit later, but definitely just make sure you have 1.5 inches, 2 inches of extra material. This will account for any mistakes while we're quilting it, and this will also account for when we go to bind it. This is a really easy way to do binding. You don't have to mess with bias tape. You can just cut, fold, and sew, and I'm excited to show you how to do that. Now, if you were making a bigger quilt, you obviously would want to add a few more extra inches. With this, half an inch and inch and a half would be fine extra. If I'm making a full-size quilt, I would probably leave 4 to 6 inches extra, but that's just if you're doing something a lot larger with a lot more quilting. We're just going to quilt on either side of the seams that we sewed. So we are sewing just 1/4 of an inch off the seam that we sewed. This is called outline sewing. And so we're going to just go in a grid pattern, and we're going to just follow the seams that we put together. There are certainly different ways you could do this on a diagonal. You could do in the ditch quilting, but this is one of my personal favorite ways to quilt. Not doing much of a pattern, just going ahead and going just back and forth, outlining the seams that I sewed. So you will see this, but again, consistency comes with practice. So just as you're practicing that 1/4 of an inch sewing, this will also help your quilting as well. I chose to do 1/4 of an inch quilting as the outline, but you can certainly do 1/8 of an inch or any variation like that. I'm going to go ahead and cut off the strings. Let's go ahead and reposition. You can kind of see what the sewing looks like on the back. I could have used an aqua thread for this, but I just went ahead and stuck with the white. And then we're going to go down our second seam. Because it's a small project, the top isn't shifting around too much. You'll find with larger projects when you go to quilt them, you may need a walking foot, but this is pretty easy, pretty simple. It's not too much to go through the machine, but it's a really good intro into quilting and the way that it feels to have the backing, the batting, and the quilt top all going through your machine at once. I made many of these mini quilts before I ever attempted my first large quilt. This one's a little small for a doll quilt, but if you have someone that likes to play with dolls, these quilts are just adorable to make a little bit bigger. They can wrap up a cute little play doll. All right, we're going to go ahead and sew. We've turned it once so that we did sew vertical, and then we turned those lines to horizontal so that we could sew vertical again. And you'll see at the end, I'm not picking up, I'm not cutting any thread, I'm just putting my needle down, shifting it over, and then just moving it over just that 1/2 inch so that I can go down the other line. This just leaves a lot less threads that are hanging off of your quilting project that you have to cut and go back and get later. All right, just one more line and our sewing or our quilting will be done. I love this part of quilting where you're just going slow, getting it done, but you get to see all those beautiful fabrics glide through your hands. It's one of my favorite parts. You can appreciate each one as you sew over it. All right, let's go ahead, trim these, and we are going to get this off our sewing machine and lay it out to admire our beautiful quilting. All right, so that is done. It's nice and flat, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go around and trim the batting. We don't need any extra now. Got to remind myself to move it in front of the camera for you, and then trim that batting off. I did go ahead and edit some footage out here because I was really struggling with the scissors. So I moved to some smaller scissors. There we go. I'm even struggling with these. But there we go. I went ahead and cut all of the batting off. So we're going to go ahead and now cut our backing for the fold over binding. So I first started with 1.5 inches. I thought, okay, that should be a good size to fold it over once and then fold it over again. In just a minute, you're going to see that I did not like how large that binding was. Just with these small squares, I thought it would be a little bit better. So in just a minute, I'm going to show you how I actually go back. I'm using a rotary cutter, but you could certainly do this by hand. Just measure it off, even if you want to use a ruler to just go ahead and mark however much you want. I really need a pin cushion. That is definitely going to be one of my next projects coming up. So if you need a pin cushion, definitely keep an eye on the channel. So this is where I fold it over. Again, I thought about folding it over twice or 3 times to get a little smaller, but I just thought 1.5 inches was a little bit too big of a binding. So I'm going to go ahead back and cut off 1/2 inch, cut it all down to 1 inch. And that will give us, I think, a better size binding for the size of my mini quilt. I normally, when I'm doing my binding for large quilts, I'll maybe do them 2 inches so that by the time they're sewn and folded over, it may be a little bit thicker than 1/2 inch, but this one I just liked that it was a little bit smaller. Alright, so you're going to fold it twice and then go ahead and start pinning. You're not going to pin all 4 sides at once. You're going to go ahead and pin 2 sides, the opposite sides of each other, and then come back and pin the others. So you got one side. You can certainly put as many or as few pins as you want. There's no right or wrong answer. And you can even use, I've seen a lot of sewers going to little clips that they put on there. I don't have any of those. I was taught to sew using pins, but I have thought about getting some of those little clips. We'll see if those make it into my supplies. And then we are just going to sew right along the edge of that binding. All right, there you did. I did it super close to the edge, as close as I could without going off, but you could certainly do 1/8 of an inch or however much close you can. All right, so 2 of our sides are now have the binding on it. And what I'm going to do, this is a step that's optional, but I'm going to trim down that folded side that sticks over just so it has a little less bulk as I go to fold that. Right now it's got 4 layers or 3 layers. So by the time we fold it, it's going to add more. So I'm just kind of cutting those off so that when I go to fold, it's a little bit easier. Make sure you don't cut anything important. Don't cut through and accidentally cut through the binding or cut your quilt top or the backing. Those would all be bad things to do. That's what small little sharp scissors come in handy to just do these small jobs. One more of these little corners to trim, and then we'll be able to go ahead, fold this, and finish our quilt top. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead, again, fold it just like I was. I'm going to fold these corners in, and then fold them in half, and then fold them in half again. And I'm going to pin right up next to this corner so that that fold doesn't go anywhere. I don't want it pulling out and sticking out the other end with some excess. All right, again, just fold and fold again. Because I did both ends, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin right in the middle here. Do keep in mind that if you use this kind of binding, the way the backing folds over, you do want to use a coordinating backing. That way it matches with the rest of your quilt. Some people like to do really a pop of color in the back, not necessarily matching, but you do want it to complement if it's going to be the binding as well. Almost done. All right, let's go to our sewing machine and sew these last two bindings on. Here we go. Again, you can see I'm just going as close to the side as I can. This does take some practice. So you may want to try on a couple scraps piece of fabric before you sew on your mini quilt. Get those pins out of there. And you're going to want to back stitch at the beginning and the end of this binding as well. That is really important to make sure that it also stays nice and secure. Awesome. How does that corner look? Very good. All right, it's not bulky, it's nice and flat. The other side, ooh, this is when it starts getting exciting because you're almost finished your project. This project is great to use if you have leftover quilt blocks from a project, or maybe you had just enough to do a sample quilt block. You can certainly just make a mini quilt out of it, put it around, hang it up. It is so cute, and it's not a huge time investment. Back stitch. All right, here is our finished quilt. Let's get the machine out of the way. Let's trim off these last few threads, and then we get to admire our work. Nice and flat. It's got a low loft batting, so it's not very poofy. You can see the quilting on the back. Ah, very, very nice. I think it's just the perfect weight. My sewing machine just has such nice stitches. I just got a new sewing machine and really like it. And that's it. I hope everyone sewed along with me and has their own small mini quilt that you can keep around and decorate with, or you can give away for friends. Thanks so much for stopping by. Like and subscribe if you liked this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.